She set the last fork down, stepped back, and checked the table twice before the doorbell rang in 1954. One wrong utensil and the whole evening would tell on her. Every well-raised woman in post-war America carried a private rule book in her head. Nobody handed her a written copy. She absorbed it at her mother's table in a home economics classroom and from a stack of etiquette books that sat on nearly every wedding gift table of the decade. These table rules were not about impressing anyone. They were about making a room full of near strangers feel instantly at ease, course after course, without a single wasted word. The two books that mattered most were written by very different women. Emily Post published her first etiquette guide back in 1922, and by the 1950s her name had become a verb. People said something was or was not very Emily Post of you. Then, in 1952, a journalist named Amy Vanderbilt released her own complete book of etiquette, and it became a Book of the Month Club pick almost overnight, giving suburban housewives a second, slightly softer voice to follow. Emily Post was not born teaching manners. She was raised in an old-money Baltimore family, wrote novels in her 20s and 30s, and only turned to etiquette writing in her 50s after a very public divorce reshaped her life. Amy Vanderbilt, despite that grand surname, had no connection to the railroad fortune. She was a working reporter who built her authority through research and interviews, not inherited status. The rule givers were not who people assumed. Before any of this reached a dinner table, it was drilled into girls in a classroom. Home economics was close to universal in American public high schools by the 1950s, built on federal funding that dated back to 1917. Girls set portable card tables with mismatched practice flatware, folded napkins against a stopwatch, and took turns playing hostess while a teacher graded their posture, their pacing, and whether they remembered to let the guest of honor sit first. A home ec teacher did not just show a table setting once and move on. She made a girl set it, unset it, and set it again, sometimes 3 or 4 times in a single class period, until her hands moved without hesitation. The goal was never memorization for a test. It was muscle memory, the kind that let a woman set a table for 12 without once stopping to think, even while carrying on a conversation at the same time. The forks always went on the left. The knife sat on the right with its blade turned inward, facing the plate, never outward like a threat. Spoons lined up beside the knife. And if the meal had courses, you worked from the outside in, one utensil at a time, so by the final bite, you had somehow used every piece without a single spoken instruction. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works exactly the same way today. The bread plate sat up and to the left, just above the forks, small and easy to overlook if you had never been taught to look for it. A nervous guest at his first formal dinner might reach across the table and butter another man's bread without realizing it, a mistake etiquette writers mentioned often enough that it must have happened constantly. The rule was simple once you knew it. Your bread plate sits on your left, always, no exceptions. Water glasses and wine glasses had their own fixed geography too, arranged above the knife in a specific order moving from largest to smallest as you scanned left to right. A guest who reached for the wrong glass was gently, silently corrected simply by watching what the hostess touched first. Nobody said a word. The whole system was built so that watching, not asking, was how you learned your way through an unfamiliar table. Here is the part almost nobody explains correctly. Most people assume the fussy European way of holding a fork in the left hand and never switching. It was the real 1950s standard, the fancy one, the correct one. It was not. American etiquette manuals of the decade taught the opposite. You cut with the knife in your right hand, set it down, and switched the fork over to eat. That so-called zigzag style was the official American default, not a lesser cousin of anything European. Continental style, the one where the fork tines stay pointed down in the left hand the entire meal, was still taught in the very same books. It was never labeled wrong, it was labeled European, an accepted alternative for anyone raised abroad or simply drawn to it. A hostess who noticed a guest eating continental style was not supposed to correct him. Both styles sat side by side in the same rulebook, equally proper, simply different roads to the same destination. Elbows off the table sounds like a small thing, almost silly by modern standards, a scolding line mothers repeated out of habit. But the etiquette writers of the era explained the real reason behind it, and it had nothing to do with elbows themselves. Planting an elbow on the table crowded the space of the person beside you and made you loom over your plate instead of sitting upright and present. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. That rule got repeated hardest at the family table, more than at any formal dinner party. It makes sense once you think about it. Children learned posture and pacing at home, at the everyday supper, long before they ever sat down at a table with place cards and multiple forks. By the time a young woman attended her first real formal dinner, the elbow rule was already so automatic she was not even thinking about it anymore. Sitting up straight, without leaning on the table's edge, keeping your napkin in your lap the instant you sat down rather than waiting, and never reaching across another guest's plate were treated as a single connected posture, not separate rules. Etiquette writers of the period described good table posture almost like good handwriting. It was not just about looking correct. It signaled that you were paying attention to the people around you, not just the food in front of you. Nobody touched a fork until the hostess picked up hers first. That single pause looks like pure formality from a distance, but it solved a real logistical problem. With 6, 8, sometimes 12 people at a table, and food arriving from the kitchen course by course, that pause kept everyone finishing together, so the next course could be cleared and served without half the table sitting empty-handed while the other half was still eating soup. Resting your fork and knife crossed on the plate, roughly where the hands of a clock would sit at 10 and 4, told the hostess one thing without a single word. "I am still eating. Please do not clear my plate." Turn them instead so they lay side by side at an angle, and the message flipped just as silently. "I am finished. You may take this away." A whole conversation happened in cutlery, and everyone in the room could read it. A dropped napkin during the meal was not chased loudly under the table. A woman simply left it and quietly asked for a fresh one, or a household with help would have a maid slip a replacement onto her lap without comment. Diving under a formal table in front of 6 guests to retrieve a fallen napkin was considered far more disruptive than the small act of losing it in the first place. A woman did not powder her nose or reapply her lipstick at the table. Not once, not quietly, not behind a raised napkin. Any touch-up happened in the powder room, away from the meal entirely. It reflected something bigger about the era. Grooming was private business, done before you appeared, not a performance staged in front of the very people you were trying to charm over dinner. Even conversation topics were quietly rationed at a formal table, in a way most modern hosts have completely forgotten. A hostess planned her seating not just by gender but by interest, placing the amateur gardener beside the man who kept bees, the new mother beside the grandmother of 6, engineering small overlapping conversations the way a good editor arranges a magazine. Nothing at that table was left entirely to chance, not even who sat and talked to whom. When 8 or more guests sat down together, a hostess did not gesture vaguely toward the table and let people sort themselves out. She used place cards, printed or carefully hand-lettered, one at every seat. Men and women alternated around the table by a fixed formula, and the guest of honor took the seat to her right. Every chair had already been decided before a single guest walked through the door. RSVP was not a polite suggestion in the 1950s. It was closer to a contract. A written invitation demanded a written or telephoned answer within days because a formal dinner depended on an exact head count. Even in homes with no live-in staff, many hostesses hired a girl for just that one evening to serve and clear the courses, and she needed to know precisely how many plates to set before she ever walked through the kitchen door. A guest who failed to respond and simply showed up, or worse, failed to show up at all after accepting, was remembered for it. Etiquette books of the era treated a broken RSVP almost like a broken promise, not a minor social slip. The reasoning was practical rather than precious. Food had already been bought, a table had already been set, and a missing guest left an empty chair that threw off the entire carefully planned seating chart. Thank you notes and invitations were handwritten, always, never typed. A typed thank you note was considered a small but real offense in the etiquette books of the decade, a sign that the sender could not be bothered to spend the extra minutes by hand. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down. A handwritten line meant someone had actually stopped, sat at a desk, and thought about you specifically before they wrote a single word. The thank you note was expected within a matter of days after a dinner, not weeks, and it was supposed to mention something specific about the evening, not a generic pleasantry. Etiquette writers gave sample phrasing that referenced a particular dish or a particular moment of conversation, because a vague note signaled that the guest had barely paid attention to the evening at all. Specificity was the whole proof of genuine gratitude. A full sterling silver place setting from a maker like Gorham, International Silver or Towel, ran somewhere around $30 to $50 in the early 1950s, a real sum for a young couple furnishing a first home. Silver plate cost far less, often under $15 a setting, and that gap explains why most middle-class kitchens ran on silver plate every night while sterling stayed locked in a felt-lined chest for company only. Brides did not walk into a marriage owning a complete formal service. They registered a china, crystal, and silver pattern at a department store, a practice that had spread widely by the 1950s, and then guests bought place settings as gifts over years, sometimes an entire decade. A young wife might host her first dinner party with 4 matching place settings and 2 mismatched extras quietly turned face down so nobody noticed the difference. That felt-lined chest of sterling was not simply stored. It was maintained, polished by hand every few weeks, whether it had been used or not, because tarnish crept in even inside a closed drawer. Polishing silver became its own small ritual, often done at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon with a soft cloth and a jar of pink polish. The smell of it as familiar to a household as fresh coffee. Not every meal in a 1950s home looked like a magazine photograph. Etiquette writers themselves drew a hard line between 3 very different tables. A family supper needed one simple setting and nothing more. A company dinner added a bread plate and an extra fork. Only a true formal dinner party called for multiple courses, wine glasses, and place cards. Oversetting a plain Tuesday supper was itself considered a small mistake. A detail modern nostalgia often flattens into one imagined golden evening. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and the ordinary weeknight table is where it hides best. Most families in the decade ate a simple, modest supper most nights of the week, meatloaf or a casserole, nothing that needed a bread plate or a second fork. The elaborate rules people picture when they hear the word 1950s belonged specifically to hosting occasions, not to daily life, and collapsing the two misses most of what actually happened at most tables. Money, religion, and politics stayed off the table, and that rule was already 100 years old by the time a 1950s hostess repeated it to her daughter. But it had a fresh, practical purpose in the post-war suburbs specifically. Dinner parties increasingly mixed neighbors and co-workers who were not old family friends, people from different churches, different backgrounds, thrown together by a new subdivision rather than a lifetime of shared history. The old rule protected a newly unpredictable guest list. If a conversation drifted somewhere dangerous, toward a heated opinion or an awkward silence, the hostess was trained to redirect it, not ignore it. Etiquette writers taught specific rescue lines, a quick compliment about the meal, a question aimed at the quietest guest, anything that steered the table back toward common ground. A skilled hostess could redirect an entire room without anyone at the table ever realizing they had been redirected at all. Passing food around a table followed its own quiet compass. Dishes moved to the right, always, so two people never reached for the same serving spoon at the same time. A guest who passed the wrong direction was gently corrected without a word, simply by the hostess redirecting the dish the other way. It was one more small system built to prevent the tiny collisions that happen when a dozen hands and elbows share one table. Salt and pepper traveled together, never separated, even if only one was requested. If a guest at the far end asked for salt, it arrived paired with the pepper shaker, whether he wanted it or not. The logic was almost comic in its precision. Separating them risked one shaker getting stranded across the table for the rest of the meal, and a properly run table left nothing stranded, not even a pepper shaker. Soup was eaten by tipping the spoon away from you, scooping toward the far edge of the bowl rather than toward your own body, and the spoon was sipped from the side, never inserted into the mouth head-on like a shovel. It sounds impossibly fussy written out loud, but the goal was simple. Quiet spoons, no dripping, no splashing, and a woman who could finish an entire bowl of soup without a single audible slurp at a table of 12 strangers. Bread was never cut with a knife at a formal table, not even into neat little squares. It was broken by hand into small pieces, buttered one bite at a time rather than all at once, and eaten in those same small bites. A whole slice buttered edge to edge, and then bitten into looked, to the trained eye of the period, almost childish, a habit fine for the kitchen table, but never for company. A woman never applied her napkin like a bib, tucked into a collar or spread flat across her chest. It unfolded halfway and rested across her lap, quietly catching what needed catching without ever being visible from across the table. The rule assumed a kind of invisible competence, the idea that a properly raised woman simply would not need a bib in the first place, so the napkin never had to look like one. Even the way a woman entered a dining room mattered before she ever reached her chair. She waited to be seated, or, if no man was present to pull her chair, she seated herself smoothly from the left side without a fuss. Etiquette manuals described the correct entrance almost like stage direction because the first 30 seconds at a table set the tone for the entire evening, and a fumbled entrance was hard to recover from gracefully. A hostess timed her courses almost like a stage manager backstage, watching the pace of conversation as closely as the food itself. If talk was flowing well, she let a course linger a few extra minutes before signaling the next. If the table had gone quiet, she moved things along faster, understanding instinctively that an awkward silence over a half-eaten plate was far worse than a slightly rushed dessert course. Wine, when it appeared at all, followed its own quiet order, poured from the guest's right, and never filled past a certain point in the glass, leaving room for the aroma to gather rather than the glass to simply hold more liquid. Overfilling a wine glass was considered almost as clumsy as spilling it, a small detail that separated someone who had been taught from someone simply guessing their way through the evening. Dessert forks and spoons often sat above the plate rather than beside it, a detail that confused newcomers until someone explained the logic. Placing them horizontally above the main setting kept the side arrangement from growing too cluttered while still signaling clearly that a sweet course was coming. A guest who noticed that small spoon above the plate knew, without asking, exactly what to expect before the meal was even half finished. Even leaving the table mid-meal had a correct form. A guest excused herself quietly, napkin left loosely on the seat of her chair rather than tossed onto the table, and returned without announcement or explanation. The napkin's placement mattered more than people realize today. Left on the chair, it signaled the guest was coming back. Left on the table, it read as a signal the meal was over for that person, whether that was the intention or not. Children at a formal table, when they were included at all, were held to the exact same rules as the adults, simply taught earlier and more gently. A child who mastered the fork left, knife right logic by age 7 or 8 was not unusual. Etiquette writers of the period believed manners were not something you graduated into as an adult. They were something you were expected to arrive with, already practiced, the moment you were old enough to sit at the good table. A guest who finished eating before everyone else did not push the plate away or announce it. She simply set her silverware in the finished position and continued the conversation as though nothing had changed, waiting patiently for the table to catch up. Rushing a hostess to clear a plate, or worse, reaching to clear it herself, was considered far more awkward than the small discomfort of sitting with an empty plate a few extra minutes. A hostess never apologized excessively for her own cooking, no matter how a dish turned out. Etiquette manuals specifically warned against the habit of announcing a failed soufflé or an overcooked roast before guests had even tasted it. Drawing attention to a flaw only guaranteed everyone would notice it. A confident hostess served the meal, said nothing self-deprecating, and let the evening's conversation carry the room instead of the food alone. Compliments to the cook were expected, but they had a correct shape too. A guest praised a specific dish, the way the roast had been seasoned or how light the rolls turned out, rather than offering a vague general compliment about the whole meal. Specific praise, again, was the recurring theme across nearly every rule in this decade. Vague gestures were treated as almost worse than silence because they suggested the guest had not truly been paying attention. A cocktail hour before dinner, when hosted, was kept strictly separate from the meal itself, usually in a different room entirely, the living room or the parlor, never at the dining table. Guests were expected to nurse 1 or 2 drinks slowly during that hour, and etiquette writers were blunt about the reason. A guest who arrived at the table already unsteady had failed at the single most basic obligation of being invited anywhere at all. The transition from the parlor to the dining room was itself a small ceremony. A hostess or host announced dinner was served, and guests moved together, rarely rushing, often pairing off by the same alternating formula that would seat them at the table. Nothing about the evening was left to drift on its own. Even the walk from one room to another followed an understood order. A man was expected to stand when a woman left or returned to the table, a small gesture repeated so many times across a single dinner party that it became almost invisible, like breathing. Etiquette writers rarely explained why anymore by the 1950s. The gesture had simply survived from an older code of manners, carried forward less out of active belief and more out of sheer habit, passed down through generations of dinner tables. Even leftovers had a correct social handling. A hostess never sent guests home with food unless she offered first, and they accepted plainly, and guests never asked to take home extra portions of a dish they had enjoyed. The etiquette books treated this as a matter of dignity on both sides, protecting the hostess from feeling her generosity was being tested, and protecting the guest from appearing to angle for a favor. A guest was expected to arrive within a narrow window, never more than 10 or 15 minutes past the stated time, and never early enough to catch a hostess still finishing her preparations. Arriving too early was treated almost as rudely as arriving too late, because it put the hostess in an impossible position, still setting the table or dressing while a guest waited awkwardly in the front hall. A hostess gift, when brought, was small and specific, flowers already arranged, so she would not have to stop and find a vase mid-evening, or a small box of chocolates, never anything that demanded immediate attention or preparation. The gift existed to acknowledge the effort of hosting without adding one more task to an already full evening. Even generosity had to be considered carefully in this decade, shaped around the receiving hostess's actual workload. Tupperware parties launched nationally in 1951 under a saleswoman named Brownie Wise, and on the surface they look like nothing but a sales gimmick. Underneath, they reveal exactly the same instinct that shaped the dinner table: Women built structured social rituals with clear roles, a script, and a rhythm everyone understood before they walked in the door. Hospitality itself had a grammar in this decade, and it showed up everywhere, not only at the formal dinner table. The Depression and the Second World War had already tested every one of these rules before the 1950s even began. Formal dining shrank hard during the Depression for the plainest reason: families could not afford it, and it shrank again during the war as domestic help left for factory jobs and rationing limited what any table could offer. Etiquette writers of those years pivoted to what they called gracious simplicity, teaching women how to keep the spirit of the standard with far less to work with. By the time the war ended, something had shifted underneath all of it. The GI Bill put millions of new families into their first owned homes, and for many of them, hosting a correct company dinner became a quiet marker that they had truly arrived in the middle class. The rules were not just about manners anymore. They were proof, plate by plate, fork by fork, that a family belonged exactly where it had landed. Even as formality peaked, the first cracks were already showing. Swanson introduced its frozen TV dinner in the winter of 1953, a tray meant to be eaten in front of the television set, rather than at a set table with a hostess presiding over each course. Nobody saw it as a threat to table manners at the time. It was marketed as a convenience for busy nights, but it planted a habit that would quietly compete with the sit-down meal for the rest of the century. Etiquette books of the era spent surprisingly little time on perfection and a surprising amount of time on mistakes. What to do when a fork clatters to the floor, how to recover when you reach for the wrong glass. The real lesson underneath all of it was composure, not flawlessness. A hostess who dropped a spoon and calmly asked for a fresh one was considered more mannerly than a guest who never made an error at all, because grace under a small disaster was the actual skill being taught. A spilled glass of water was handled the same calm way. A guest apologized once, briefly, and then let the hostess or the help manage the cleanup without further comment or fuss. Drawing the moment out with repeated apologies was considered worse manners than the spill itself, because it forced every other guest to keep dwelling on an accident that everyone else had already been ready to move past. Even a burnt or overcooked dish had a scripted social response built into the manuals. A guest never commented on the quality of food served in someone's home, not even lightly, not even as a joke. The rule assumed that a guest's job at the table was to make the hostess comfortable, not to offer an honest review, and that distinction still separates a genuinely gracious guest from a merely polite one. The formal rules did not vanish overnight in some single dramatic moment, no matter how satisfying that story would be to tell. They eroded slowly across decades as more women entered the paid workforce with less time for multi-course evenings, as home economics classes quietly disappeared from one school district after another, and as casual restaurant dining and eventually takeout food replaced the nightly ritual of a properly set table. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. By the 1960s, casual entertaining styles were already gaining ground alongside the formal dinner party, buffet-style meals where guests filled their own plates and found a seat wherever they liked. Etiquette writers of the following decades did not fight this shift so much as they adapted to it, writing new chapters on buffet etiquette that borrowed the same underlying logic, just applied to a far more relaxed format. By the 1990s and into the 2000s, home economics had disappeared from most American public school curriculums, replaced or simply cut as schools reallocated class time elsewhere. That single institutional change matters more than people realize. It was the classroom, not just the family table, that had made these rules close to universal knowledge for generations of American girls. Once that classroom disappeared, the rules stopped transmitting automatically, and an entire vocabulary of the table simply stopped being spoken. It is worth being honest about something here, the same honesty this channel always tries to hold on to. Not every household in the 1950s followed these rules with equal precision, and plenty of families never owned a single piece of sterling silver at all. Class, region, and religion all shaped how strictly a household followed Post or Vanderbilt, and pretending otherwise flattens a much richer, more varied picture of the decade into a single glossy postcard. Even Post and Vanderbilt disagreed with each other on real points, small but genuine differences in how strictly to alternate seating by gender, or whether a butter knife was strictly required at an informal family meal. The two most trusted authorities in the country were not reciting identical scripture. They were offering competing, evolving opinions, and households picked whichever voice felt closest to their own sense of what mattered. Here is the part that should feel encouraging rather than discouraging. Nothing about these rules actually expired. They were never really about status or showing off silver. Every etiquette writer of the decade, Post included, framed the point of a correct table the same way over and over. Consideration for the person sitting beside you. Nobody at that table should ever feel confused, embarrassed, or unsure what to do next. That is not an outdated goal. It is a timeless one wearing an old-fashioned coat. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore. And lately, a lot of people seem to be noticing the gap. Etiquette coaching businesses have grown steadily in recent years, teaching young professionals, brides, and parents the very rules that used to be assumed knowledge, the exact things a 1950s home economics teacher would have drilled into a room of 15-year-old girls without a second thought. The demand did not disappear. Only the classroom did. Social media has quietly become the new classroom for a generation that never had home economics at all. Short videos teaching napkin folds, correct fork placement, and handwritten thank you notes circulate widely among young adults, many of whom describe learning these rules for the very first time as adults from a stranger online rather than a mother or a teacher. The information survived. It just moved to a completely different room. It is easy to romanticize all of this from a distance, and this channel tries hard never to do that without also naming the cost. The same decade that produced this beautiful, precise choreography of hospitality also expected the woman managing it to do so almost entirely alone, unpaid, and largely unthanked, on top of every other responsibility already resting on her shoulders. Appreciating the skill does not require pretending the burden was evenly shared. And yet, when you strip away the burden and just look at the craft itself, there is something genuinely worth admiring in how deliberately this generation of women thought about the experience of everyone around their table. Every fork placement, every seating chart, every quiet redirection of an awkward silence was an act of attention, planned in advance, executed without any credit expected in return. That kind of quiet skill rarely gets called a skill at all, but it was one. If you want to try even one small piece of this yourself, the etiquette manuals suggest starting somewhere far simpler than a 12-course dinner. Set your table with forks on the left and knife blade in on the right just once for an ordinary weeknight meal with no company coming at all. Notice how different the same food feels when the table around it has been considered on purpose rather than simply used. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down, and it was never really about which fork to pick up first. It was about walking into any room, any table, any unfamiliar company, and knowing exactly how to make everyone around you feel steady. That confidence did not come from a rule book alone. It came from a whole culture that agreed the rules mattered enough to teach them on purpose, generation after generation, at kitchen tables and card tables alike. None of this required wealth in the end, even though wealth could buy sterling silver and a bigger dining room. The core of it, the outside-in forks, the waiting for the hostess, the specific compliment, the quiet redirect of an awkward moment, cost nothing at all beyond attention and practice. That may be the most overlooked truth in this entire history. The most valuable rule in the whole rulebook was simply paying close attention to somebody else. Good manners, remember, even when we forget. This decade did not invent kindness at the table, but it did something modern life rarely bothers to do anymore. It wrote the kindness down into specific, teachable, repeatable steps so that even a nervous 19-year-old on her first dinner party could walk in and know exactly how to make a stranger feel welcome without needing a lifetime of social confidence to get there first. Somewhere in a drawer, a lot of us still have the sterling our grandmothers registered for, waiting for an occasion that matches it. Maybe that occasion is smaller than a 12-course dinner party. Maybe it is just one quiet supper where you set the table properly, on purpose, for no reason except that it still means something. If this brought back a memory of your own family table, tell me about it below, and I will see you in the next one.